Hey guys, welcome. So yeah, we'll get started. I'm Killian Daly, Executive Director at EnergyTag, which is a non-profit focused on reform of electricity carbon accounting, and in particular using more granular data to make that accounting more accurate. So today's session is called What's Clean? How granular data holds the answers to clean electrification and trade. Joined by a fantastic panel of experts here today. So Eloy Fabrega from FlexiDAO, Katrine Verwimp from the Association of Issuing Bodies, Devin Sweezy from Google, and finally Nicholas Bernardi from EnergyNet. So I'm going to keep it quite informal. I'll do a quick introduction to the topic and then ask a few questions to the panelists. And would really like your input as well, so definitely get your questions ready. We'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So basically what this session is about is trying to answer what's a pretty fundamental question, is what is clean? What's clean electricity consumption? And therefore, what is clean hydrogen? What is clean steel? What's a clean data center? And we actually don't have very good answers for that question today. We're starting to get there, thanks to some of the people in this room. But it's something we don't answer very well today. So electricity carbon accounting is done at like a very low granularity generally over like the period of a year. So you could theoretically be powered by solar energy all night long, which doesn't really make sense if we want to incentivize demand flexibility and storage, for example. And also over very broad geographical boundaries. So you could be powered on renewable energy produced in Norway if you're based in Portugal, for example. So we have very large temporal and spatial boundaries, and what EnergyTag advocates for is much more granular and narrower temporal and spatial boundaries. Because ultimately what we need to do is match in real time clean power with demand at all times in all grids. And so that's the ultimate goal here. That's the markets we need to create, and that's the tracking we need to do. And fundamentally, this all comes back to high granularity consumption and generation data. And in order to track these things, so to track these electricity contracts and purchases, we need something called granular certificates. So physical electrons cannot be tracked on a power system, so we need energy tracking systems, energy attribute tracking systems that basically act as a type of digital twin to the power system and enable us to do this granular tracking. There's a lot of research been done on this topic as well, so papers from Princeton University, the Technical University of Berlin, MIT, DTU in Denmark, that have shown that if we do change the way we do electricity carbon accounting, if we change the way electricity markets work, we'll send much more targeted signals for the build-out of renewables, but also flexible demand and also flexible supply. So storage, for example, with proper clean electricity tracking, we can send new signals that incentivize storage. Also, these are much better ways of defining things like clean hydrogen. Using much more granular data, much more granular electricity tracking really helps us ensure that hydrogen production is clean. And we've seen this emerging in regulations. So in the European Union, renewable hydrogen, the rules for the production of renewable hydrogen will require electricity to be sourced from renewable sources within the same hour and on the same grid as the electrolyzer's consumption. And that's actually really new. It may be surprising for some of you to learn that, but that's pretty novel. The standard way of doing this, again, is to say just buy something produced anywhere in Europe at any time of year, and that's enough to say I'm green. If we did that and built out a hydrogen sector based on those rules, we would build a lot of new gas capacity locally and use attributes from other countries to call that green when it's not. So this is actually a very fundamental question for industrial decarbonization. Another point I want to touch on is the importance of common standards. So it's very important that Europe does this tracking in the same way as the US if we want to trade clean hydrogen or clean steel, or if we want our companies to count their emissions in the same way. It's super important to have common standards that make sure things are being done properly without double counting. And so this battle is starting to emerge in more, I think, general conversations around electricity, around the energy transition in general. We've seen long-form articles in the Financial Times recently about this question: how do companies do their carbon accounting? What is the best way forward here? There's very different answers to that question. And things like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which sets the rules for electricity carbon accounting, are under review. So the next year or two are absolutely critical for defining how this question gets answered globally. So I definitely recommend you go and read some of the journalism from FT, Bloomberg, MIT Tech Review on this topic. So that's enough from me. I'm going to start with a couple of questions for the panel. And I'm going to start with Katrine from the Association of Issuing Bodies, which is basically the organization which oversees energy tracking in Europe today. I think about 800 or 900 terawatt hours of energy is tracked through the systems represented by the Association of Issuing Body members. So you're really the arbiter of energy tracking in Europe. So tell us why that's important, Katrine, and how moving to increase granularity in energy tracking over time can help move these systems forward.
Thanks for the good question. I think the market has proven its relevance on the why of energy tracking when it initiated a voluntary standard more than 2 decades ago, so which resulted in the current European energy certificate system being indeed a voluntary standard operated by AIB for and by its members. So it's constantly further refined by decisions of its member base. And its member base, like AIB, is a non-profit association, international association, Brussels-based, and the members are only governmentally assigned issuing bodies of guarantees of origin. And also non-governmental certificates are welcomed there under certain conditions. But it's the issuers of these guarantees of origin that are in the association and that jointly make the decisions of moving things forward. They audit each other, so they are the quality assurers of each other's systems together with a pool of professional reviewers, and that ensures the quality of it. And the main driver of it is preventing double counting. So I'm now more than 20 years in preventing double counting, and still it's a core task, it's a core attention point, and especially because the importance of energy tracking is growing so much, it's moving more and more to the center of the energy transition. Double counting is a risk around every corner because 2 decades ago we were happy that one piece of legislation in Europe integrated energy origin tracking, the Renewable Energy Directive and its follow-ups. But now, so many pieces of legislation integrate energy tracking, and it's super important that they all build on the same instrument, the same way of accounting, because that in itself is what guarantees the uniqueness of a claim. You can have beautiful pieces of legislation, beautiful accounting, but if you account the same thing twice, it doesn't matter anymore. So that's the first thing. Still preventing double claims, preventing double counting, harmonized understanding is really why we need standards. And that for international transfer inside Europe has proven to work. But it's not only for the system mechanism itself, it's also at corporate level, those who internationally have portfolios, bigger companies, they really need a harmonized way of approaching purchases and proving their green claims. So that is the big reason. And then indeed we see these days that proving double counting prevention alone seems not enough anymore. There's quite some signals here and there. The question is like, yeah, okay, fine, we have disclosure, but we have also target accounting, and they sometimes account differently. How can we go beyond just tracking the origin? How can we track impact as well? And that's where we see really demand signals on hourly tracking, hourly or closer to home, closer to consumption tracking. And I feel that we observe also some criticism on the geo system if we don't really take that seriously. There's substantial risk that energy attribute certificates in general can be passed by, and that in itself would cause double counting as well. So there's not really another option than listening at these demand signals, which is what we do in AIB, and we're on a facilitatory track on further facilitating the hourly certificates for our members in our standard. We have that already facilitated. We are in AIB further standardizing this hourly certificate. But then, from there onwards, it is of course up to our members. We are not enforcing our members because they're governmentally representatives. It's up to them to take it up or not.
Great, thanks. And yeah, I think the role, it's super important because it's, these tracking systems are basically the data layer of of electricity claims and trying to prove if something is clean or not. So it's super important that that data layer is representing the reality as well as possible. I'll now go on to Devin from Google, obviously a major renewable energy buyer and consumer of electricity also. One thing that I find quite interesting is that you guys have obviously taken some of the more ambitious targets in terms of clean electricity consumption. You know, I think it's quite unique. A lot of organizations are happy to stick with today's way of doing things, but you seem to be taking a strong lead in helping push things forward. Why is that, and how are you actually doing this in a systemic way, kind of beyond Google's boundaries?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, and thanks for having me, and hey, everybody. So maybe just by way of quick background, as you say, Google is a large electricity consumer and large buyer of renewable energy, so we have 25 terawatt hours of electricity consumption globally as of last year, and that's continuing to grow. And we've been on this journey for a long time to figure out how to operate our business as sustainably as possible. And one of the ways that we've been doing that is through the purchase of clean energy. And we signed our first long-term power purchase agreement for renewable energy way back in 2010, when it was still quite novel for companies to do that, and helped kind of scale that model for others as we were buying clean energy at scale. In 2017, we purchased so much renewable energy that for the first time, we matched our global annual electricity consumption with purchases of renewable energy. So we purchased as many megawatt hours of renewables around the world as the megawatt hours that we consume for our operations. But we knew at the time that that was a really important milestone, but it's not the same thing as fully decarbonizing our electricity consumption, as actually operating around the clock on clean energy. And so that's the goal that we decided to set for ourselves starting in 2020 that we call 24/7 carbon-free energy, which means we're trying to bring onto the same grid where we are consuming power technologies that provide clean electricity that match our hour-by-hour electricity consumption around the clock. And the goal is to do that by 2030 everywhere that we operate. And there are a couple of reasons that we set that goal. The first is that we thought it's really important to be transparent about our electricity consumption and about our progress. And even though we had met this 100% annual matching goal, that we still had more to do, and that it was okay to be transparent and open and realistic about where we're at and where we think we ultimately need to go. And the second reason is that, you know, by targeting complete decarbonization of our electricity consumption, we could try to chart a path to better understand how we need to get the entire grid system to zero carbon as quickly as possible. And you mentioned in your opening a lot of the sort of research demonstrating how, you know, as companies start to do this more local and hourly matching, we can actually have sort of an accelerated impact on the grid system. And that brings me to the topic of this panel around sort of granular data and why is granular data important. And, you know, we realized that in order to understand our hour-by-hour electricity consumption, understand the carbon intensity of the electricity that we're actually consuming, we needed to understand more granular data, both for our consumption, but also the electricity grid data and the production data from the assets that we had under contract. And initially, that was somewhat challenging to get for all of our operations, but we worked closely with a lot of partners, including FlexiDAO, represented on the panel here, EnergyTag, to think about how do we certify this at a more granular level, and how do we scale this granular data, not just for Google, but for all companies and all consumers that want to adopt this approach. And that's also why we've engaged significantly in this question of standards development as well, because in order for this approach to scale, in order for companies and organizations to have granular understandings of their electricity consumption and how to more directly address it, we need to have a standard way for measuring, we need to have a standard way for accounting and understanding the carbon intensity of electricity consumption. And then that gets into, you know, some of the standards that we've been working on, including the carbon data specification standard that was mentioned earlier in some panels today, also EnergyTag, but importantly, as you mentioned, Killian, the greenhouse gas protocol, and thinking about what's needed to really provide a more accurate understanding of corporate electricity consumption and the emissions associated with that, so that we can understand how to more adequately address that consumption through clean energy purchasing.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a fascinating approach because it's quite systemic, I would say. working on the policy aspects, the standard aspects, but also then bringing that back to company procurement. It's definitely quite novel. So it's kudos for that. Maybe now to look at the system operator perspective. So Nicholas from EnergyNet, obviously Denmark is well known for its very high penetration of renewable electricity. And so one of the most advanced grids in the world, data infrastructure is very advanced there. Why has EnergyNet decided to work on this topic of granular certificates in Denmark? What are going to be the benefits for Denmark, basically?
Well, yeah. Let me start from the top. Part of our strategy as EnergyNet is green electricity for a better world, and my colleagues here on the panel already talked about the benefits of granular data and how granular data actually can help decarbonizing the grids. So this is pretty obvious that we should have a look into that. At the same time, we in Denmark have a data hub, and we have hourly data on electricity production and electricity consumption already. So when you already have all these data, it makes a lot of sense to look at how can these data be used for more purposes than just electricity billing. So what we did 4 years ago was start with a pilot and started some testing on the market, and we figured out that there's quite a demand for better electricity tracking. There were quite a lot of response towards the approach of having a more granular system, and then if we're talking about the TSO perspective on this, it's pretty obvious that in electricity grids with a lot of renewable energy, with a high penetration of renewable energy, that you need to incentivize that electricity is used when it's actually available. And what we are hoping for is that we can give another incentive for companies to use electricity when it's available, but at the same time also incentivize battery storage and other new technologies to go into this. So that is pretty much the why we went into it. And then the other thing was, like, when we started, there was pretty much nothing on this topic. There were some people talking about the ideas, and we had some talks to other companies, and then EnergyTag actually was founded. And we tried to figure out, okay, what is it then we can do? Because as a Danish TSO, it's like, yeah, we have a lot of data, and we have a lot of possibilities, we have a lot of digitalization, but we ourselves, we won't move the entire thing. And at the same time, EnergyTag was founded and started to work on standards. So there was not really a need to have a second entity working on standards. So what our goal then was to say, like, okay, we would like to put these standards to a test, and we want to build a real system, because it's great to have a standard, but if nobody's using these standards and nobody's actually trying this, then it's also very difficult to further develop these standards. So we tried to be like very progressive and build a system and figure out, okay, can this actually also work in real life? So yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think, so I used to work for a large French industrial company called Air Liquide, which is big, consuming more electricity than all of Denmark, actually. And so, don't say that too loud. So basically, we were testing before I joined EnergyTag back in 2019, like, well, how do we actually properly do energy tracking on a hydrogen electrolyzer? Because no one in the hydrogen industry really wanted to address that point. You know, it was very handy to just do less granular tracking, not really answer the question in detail. And so, yeah, we got put in touch with the team in EnergyNet. I think you had just started the project back then. And so I was able to show our management, you know, we can actually do this. We can connect up wind, we can connect up an electrolyzer, and really see on an hourly basis how those profiles of consumption and generation match. And that's super, super important in terms of thinking about how we track this electricity properly and operate those electrolyzers in a kind of a new and different way. Maybe talking about those like case studies and examples of this. so FlexiDAO is a company, like for those familiar with this space, who's really one of the doers, I would say, in terms of enabling this granular tracking around the world. So yeah, I'd like to maybe touch on what's possible today, Eloy. What are you doing today? How much granular matching are you enabling right now? And touching on maybe some specific case studies of what you guys are working on with some of your key clients.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question and for inviting FlexiDAO to be such a great panel. So let me start with a short introduction on what we do at FlexiDAO. So we provide software solutions for energy buyers to provide them with an oversight, a comprehensive oversight of the clean electricity portfolio for an optimized carbon accounting. So we've been working for some time already in collecting granular meter data for both consumption and production sides. Also, how we can get the energy attribute certificates that our clients are using to justify the purchases and the carbon accounting. And putting it all together also with carbon emissions data to enable some use cases such as 24/7 carbon-free energy. In terms of matching and what we're doing, so once we have the granular data, we can get production, we can get consumption, and match it. This seems pretty easy, but it goes far beyond that. So we need to verify that the production that has been bought, it's backed up by energy attribute certificates. And at the moment that you increase granularity, you also need to increase granularity of these certificates to make the matching correctly and that justification. You also need to increase granularity in carbon emissions data. So, and this, on top of the complexity of getting granular data, which is sometimes in some regions a blocker by itself. And just to provide some numbers here, so right now we track into our software solutions annually around 50 terawatt hours of electricity, and from those around 8, 9, I think, are matched and backed up by bilateral contracts and the corresponding energy attribute certificates. And about a case study, well, we need to highlight our collaboration with Google, as Demon was saying. So aligning it with their goal on becoming 24/7 2030, we're onboarding their consumption and also onboarding all the renewable purchases that they have and monitor their performance on 24/7 carbon-free energy KPIs on different regions. We started back in 2021 with 3 pilot projects, Netherlands, Ireland, in Denmark, and after that success, now we are doing a global rollout, expanding coverage in all regions where Google has operations, in terms of matching, in terms of enabling and onboarding TX as well for the cause. So,
yeah. No, it's really great work and already quite significant volumes. 9 terawatt hours is quite a lot. And that's been really important. So like we spend quite a bit of time also talking to policymakers, kind of trying to drive them in the direction of requiring hourly for things like hydrogen. And so yeah, working, and referring to the likes of the work done by FlexiDAO is super important because you need to show that this stuff is possible. Because we've done it one way for so long, asking people to go and change things, it's always hard unless there's actually people out there showing it can be done in reality and at significant scale. I'd like to maybe just pause a minute and see if is there any questions from the audience? Oh, great. Yeah, that's what I like to see, because it's always more fun when, when the questions are impromptu. So maybe we'll start here in the front row. Yeah.
I'll repeat my question again. Yes. So I was wondering, does the balancing process of the TSOs also be affected by this? I'm talking specifically about load frequency control or demand and supply matching, or this is just for consumers with a huge energy usage to help them decarbonize?
Yeah, well, in general, I'll pass it on to the panel in a minute, but in general, when we talk about, when I refer to the carbon accounting, that is usually the end consumer of electricity, so scope 2 accounting we call it, so how they calculate their emissions. But obviously then, if they want to reach a certain target based on a certain set of accounting criteria, then that influences how they buy electricity, how they talk to their suppliers, what types of PPAs they sign, where they sign those PPAs, what portfolio of assets is involved in those PPAs. So, these rules have downstream effects as well, even if the accounting is mainly scoped on the buyers themselves. Maybe I'd open up to the panel. Nicholas, do you have anything to say on the TSO side?
No, like as you said, until now it's really about documentation and tracking the energy flows. But yeah, of course, as you mentioned, it will have some effect if it is used.
Yeah. Energy tracking is done in a book and claim way in the electricity framework. Like you put energy on the network, certificates are issued for that, and they can be traded separately, transferred separately from the commodity of the energy, and at the end they get attached to a certain consumption. And so that's the claim aspect, and the point in more hourly or more local matching is exactly bringing some criteria in restricting the usage, but still working in a book and claim way, which kind of is facilitating a lot more market, a lot more flexibility, liquidity as well of the green commodity, because the alternative is doing really tracking, contract-based tracking together with the attributes, so ensuring that you have the title to claim the greenness together with the contract still, but that is much more restricted, and we observe quite some policies going in that direction, actually, PPA-based tracking, having a risk of even double counting, one, and secondly, being so much more complex if you really want to track every contract and so the separate tracking makes it possible, but then to meet the criticism of the too wide boundaries, temporal and geographical matching is a thing that can meet the concerns somehow.
Amen. Yeah. Next question, maybe here. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
So we've been talking about energy certificates to ensure clean energy, let's say, and Google also has some interesting objectives for 2030. However, I'd like also to ask something related to the technologies that we are going to need to ensure this clean energy. So are we also tracking the primary resources that are needed to ensure these technologies? I'm talking about lithium, or from the PV panels that need a lot of silicium and so on. So nobody wants lithium mines on their backyard. Portugal has a huge reserve of lithium, is facing a lot of issues to open lithium mines. Is this also monitored by any agency? Because the energy can be clean, but it's only guaranteed if the technology that relies on something else allows it. Thank you.
I can start, or does anyone want to? Just to frame it. So basically, obviously it's a good question. This is more related to supply chain tracking. So essentially, when we talk about tracking of emissions or anything else, there's kind of like what happens directly. Then there's things called scope 2. This is indirect. So this is really electrons and steam. And then there's everything else. So, basically what we're talking about on today's panel is mainly the electricity sourcing. So what's the emissions associated with the production of that megawatt hour? Those certificates today do not track, specifically, what metals were used to make the wind turbine. So that's what I can say about the scope of the certificates. I'm not aware, it's definitely not my area of expertise at least, who is doing that tracking. But maybe others are.
I can add something. So when you are doing carbon accounting and you use carbon emission factors, you rather have direct emissions data set that just account the emissions linked to what the producing power plant is emitting. And then you have models based on more life cycle accounting, so take into account other aspects in the life cycle in the generation power plants that could increase depending on the methodology and what's actually included behind in those aspects that you were saying.
I think it's mainly in the political framework today. It hasn't entered in compliance settings. So that's where labels come in. As long as something is not in a compliance or a real requirement, it's still possible to track it voluntarily, and labels do sometimes do that, but it's indeed not that wide. Like the focus on decarbonization is kind of narrow if you have that scope in mind.
Probably just to add, I mean, being at LF Energy, what we're doing here is, or when you're doing hourly matching and hourly certificates, you're actually forced to do it digital. So there's no chance to do it without a digital system. And the beauty about a digital system is that it's pretty flexible, and you could actually add attributes to these certificates. So probably in future, we will see multiple new attributes, like probably somebody wants to buy electricity from wooden wind farms, or I don't know, what you can figure out whatever you want. The question is just if it gets a mess at some point, so it's more like on the standardization side and the legal aspects have to be figured out, but the systems are actually very flexible, and you can add whatever information you want on these certificates in the end.
And there is a place on the European Guarantee of Origin for a label stamp, just saying it complies with certain criteria.
But nowadays this is not taken into account to guarantee that a company is green, let's say. This is not yet.
There is not such a harmonized meaning of what means green.
Thank you.
Now there is, in Europe, there's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, so this is basically an EU law that's going to require, I think, 50,000 companies in Europe to report lots of different information on emissions, biodiversity indexes, many other things. So that is kind of the first global region legislation that's going to mandate this. Now, whether that goes from just reporting to compliance, maybe that would be the next step of this. That's kind of to be seen. But as maybe I mentioned earlier on, there are certain cases where regulation is requiring these certain attributes of electricity sourcing to be taken into account in order to qualify for subsidies, for example. So renewable hydrogen, you can't just do whatever you want. You have to meet certain quality criteria. And so, yeah, it's not general yet on all companies, but there are certain cases where it is. Yeah, we have a question up at the back here. Could we get the mic over?
Thanks very much. Anders Patterson, World Bank. So we've approached this issue of data centers, renewable energy, and the data gaps from the hypothesis that in the long term, emerging markets will feel a competitiveness issue if they're not able to provide the data granularity. And the research we've done so far is that from several hundred data center announcements we've seen in the past year, almost none in emerging markets come with clear commitments on renewable energy. Now there can be a lot of reasons for that, but we believe that one of them is that many of the utilities and many of the systems in these countries are not ready to provide the data. So my question to the panel is, have anyone encountered discussions outside, you could say, the club of OECD about this, and to what extent do you consider data gaps as part of the competitiveness issue, or are we dealing more with basic issues like corporate PPAs are not yet available? So that's one question. The other question I would have is the question of, you could say, moving fast or moving with legal frameworks. So there's in one world where you get Ministry of Energy to pass a directive that says utilities and others need to provide these energy tags in so and so order. And then we're looking at an implementation roadmap of possibly multiple years. Then there's another world where you go faster, maybe with the grid operator or others, you actually provide the data, maybe in a pilot stage, and then you maybe do parallel regulations. My question is, have you seen any of these work? Because my concern would be that in emerging markets, many grid operators have a very long checklist of things they need to do. And we may not get there very quickly if we do the whole legal route, etc. Sorry for the long question.
Yeah, so we'll start with the, what's happening outside the OECD regions question on data center announcements and renewables sourcing. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can start with a few reflections. So just in terms of Google's portfolio, to give a sense, outside of Europe and the United States, our main data center locations are Taiwan, Japan, and Singapore. So not necessarily developing countries per se, but some that do have sort of regulatory structures that have at times made it challenging to source clean energy at the scale that we would otherwise be seeking. And so to answer kind of the second part of your question around clean energy availability and options, I think one of the things that you are starting to see is data center companies and large industrials generally that want to buy clean energy sort of making the opportunity to do so a precondition for thinking about where we're going to be investing more in the long term. And one example I can give you is in the case of Taiwan, where we've had a data center for around a decade now. It was actually not legally possible when we set up the data center to buy clean energy directly, to sign a corporate power purchase agreement, because everything had to go through the government-owned utility. And we worked with the government to actually amend the law with other businesses as well to make that possible for the first time, and then signed the first corporate power purchase agreement in Taiwan's history for a 10 megawatt solar project, so fairly small, but then that led to many more gigawatts of procurement later on. So that's the importance of having these conversations, of sort of saying, we want to make these investments if there's a path to clean power deployment that we can support in accelerating. I think the data question is also really important because we do see, obviously the foundation for our goal is to understand the granularity of the data on the consumption side, on the grid side, and we do see some gaps regionally in terms of that data being either available or easily accessible to companies through the formats that folks like EnergyNet and others are making very widely available here in Europe. And so I think that's an area where regulators and governments and industry can work together, also with standard setters, with organizations like Linux Foundation Energy, to understand what's needed to make that data more available for companies.
Anyone else on that question?
Yeah, just to add something, of course, for grid connected meters, we rely on the utilities and their budget or their programs to implement such smart meters. And of course, the rollout, it's not equal in all parts of the world, but we need, as an industry, create a consensus on what to do in those cases. For example, for carbon accounting, when the data at the utility level doesn't exist, do we rely in telemetry, for example, in data centers or in sensors, or what's the approach? We use synthetic load profiles, so there's still debate on that, so we need to make sure that we all align and follow the same procedures if we focus on an important practice such as carbon accounting.
Yeah, maybe, just to touch on that a bit myself. So EnergyTag recently, we've hired someone based in India. Previously, I've worked on projects in South Africa, so I think things have, for sure in the OECD countries in general, it's probably much easier to get this data and much easier to sign things like PPA contracts. But things have changed a lot. Like in India now, there's legal obligations to provide hourly data or 15-minute settlement data, I think, for all PPAs. So that's quite good. It means that anyone with a long-term contract for renewables in India, they have the data to do this matching already because they're probably metering on their consumption site. South Africa was a place where 10 years ago you could not sign any renewables. Now it's a pretty growing market. So, and I think also there's probably examples where countries could even leapfrog. There's places like there's places like in Europe, certain countries in Europe where you have hundreds of DSOs, where you have pretty embedded older systems for managing data, for interaction. Where new countries that are starting to do metering, they can start from scratch and learn from the best in class cases. Maybe one thing that also I think will impact a lot what's happening outside of Europe and maybe in the US is carbon border mechanisms, taxes that will be put on products entering the European Union from third countries. Because if you can prove by buying renewables that your aluminium is lower carbon intensity than the default or the average, there's going to be a very, very clear business case for getting this data. And that's being phased in with the CBAM regulation over the coming years. So that's just a couple of comments I would have on that one. You had a second question. I'm just keeping an eye on time, but you had a second question about moving fast by basically going out there, getting the data, doing it a bit more scrappy, just to get this thing done and to get things moving, or moving slow by focusing on regulatory change, which can obviously also take a bit more time. So that approach, just to get a view from the panel on the blend there, what's the right balance, I guess. Does anyone have ideas there?
Yeah, well,
Nicholas.
I touched already on that, and I think our approach is pretty much to move fast while still going slow, probably. So we're trying to do something very much in parallel. So what you need in order to make changes to legislation is actually that you have somebody to showcase what is possible. But at the same time, our view at Energinet is, and we're also the issuing body for the current GOs. Our view is pretty much that that you need trust anchors in these systems, and you need trusted data, and you need somebody who actually kind of has the authority to issue these granular certificates and to handle them. So our approach was pretty much to figure out how we can support a market for granular certificates, where we do the issuance and the matching, and at the same time have a digital system which is open for the market, so that third-party market players can actually build their solutions on top of that. And this is also what we are now going to showcase together with Google and FlexiDAO, where FlexiDAO is going to be a third party to our system and Google will be the customer. So here we really have this, like us as an issuing body, issuing the certificates, and also do the matching. But FlexiDAO being the company who's handling the contracts and who's building UI and all these sorts of things. And then probably as a second part, when you want to move fast and still go slow, sometimes it's good to go together with some other people who are going in the same direction. So this is why we entered or established a collaboration between other TSOs in Europe. So yeah, TSOs that are willing to go in the same direction. So we're really happy to work together with Elia, 50 Hertz, and Ellering, which are actually yeah, very good partners in this development. And while going together and try to figure out how we solve these issues, we also figure out like that markets in different countries are different, data sources are different. So we figure out that there are a lot of different issues that all have to be solved. And what we're trying to do is really find a system that can work all over Europe at some point.
Great. Well, I think we have pretty much run out of time. I think the next session starts in 30 seconds. So, I think it's a really good point to end on. So thank you so much to the panel, first of all. And I think that idea of moving fast and slow, thinking fast and slow, is actually a really important one. You need to move fast to innovate, but also make sure you don't move too fast that you kind of lose everyone. So we'll end it on that note. Hopefully you found it interesting. Feel free to come up to us after if you have any further questions. So thank you very much for your time.